And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Charles Christian, English barrister and Reuters correspondent turned writer, podcaster, award-winning tech journalist, and sometime werewolf hunter. He now writes, talks, and makes videos mainly about folklore, urban myths, history, and the weird. And he was even once commissioned to go on a werewolf hunt on the night of a full moon. Charles, good thing that you didn't encounter one because you may not be here with us today.
Well, exactly. Yes, it's a bit of a spoiler, but yes, I think it's fair to say if everything everybody says about werewolves are correct, then I would have been some small pieces of meat by now, or possibly returning on full moons in a slightly hairier format than I am.
Yes, that is. So how did you go from being a barrister into writing about all this folklore and urban myths and stuff? I mean, did you have some spooky clients or what?
No, it was one of those things where I had an interest in it from childhood onwards. I lived in a distinctly spooky house. It was at a time when television wasn't as prevalent as it is today. So, you know, my parents would sit around the fire in winter and tell stories and tales of people who'd had ghostly experiences and so on. And so I just grew up aware of it. And I would have liked to have done more, but at the time I was a student, there were no paranormal TV shows or ghost hunting shows or folklore courses at universities or anything. So I went off to pursue the day job. And then a lot later on, I was able to return to my interest once, you know, I'd reached a point where writing about technology, I'd sold the business to somebody else and I was able to focus on my other interests. And that's where it started from.
Yeah, that's great. It's like you've come back to your true passion.
I think that's the case. Yes, indeed. Took a long while to get back, but I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And,
that's awesome. As a barrister, did you ever come across any cases that involved the paranormal?
No, but I mean, some of the courts I appeared in were distinctly spooky. You know, there's a number of Crown courts, that's the sort of top criminal court in England, that are located in old medieval castles that have been converted and are still there. And, you know, the cells are the converted dungeons from then, and you have your pre-trial meeting with your client in a cell with a door that, you know, has had 500 years, 600 years of villains going in and out, and most of them in olden times going off to have their necks stretched or heads separated from their body in a rather quick way.
Yes.
So there's a lot of atmosphere there. There's a lot of sort of places where you think, I'm glad we finish about 4:30 on an afternoon and go home. I wouldn't like to be here in the twilight. They're very spooky.
Why do you think England in general has so much history of paranormal things, whether it be witchcraft, sorcery, fairies, dragons? And I feel like England probably has more than any other country within Europe.
I suspect people in other countries would disagree with it, but English as a language has spread globally. And I think the legends have carried globally rather more strongly than, say, legends of ghosts in Germany or France or Italy. You know, they're known to the local populations, but not elsewhere. So I think that's possibly it. And obviously, we've been stuck on our island for thousands of years. endlessly fighting each other, fighting invaders, having rebellions, cutting off kings' heads, cutting off queens' heads, generally being beastly to each other, that there's, so much has built up. If you accept the theory that a lot of ghosts are sort of residual hauntings from some traumatic event, being murdered unpleasantly or having your head cut off is a fairly unpleasant event. And it's not surprising that you get tales of, say, for example, Anne Boleyn, who must be the most commonly cited ghost in England. There's several stately homes that all say Anne Boleyn turns up here at certain times of the year. And obviously the Bloody Tower in, as it's called, in the Tower of London, where, this is a song goes, she walks the corridors with her head tucked underneath her arm. So it's I think it's not surprising that we have so much legend and folklore about ghosts, because there's so much been going on that would give rise to ghosts. I grew up in the north of England in a place called Yorkshire, and as a child there was a report of a man who was a plumber, and he was working in the basement of an old Yorkshire medieval town, still got a wall around it. And he was working in the basement of an old building there, putting in some plumbing. And a troop of Roman legionaries wearing the correct armor of the period appeared through one wall and walked across the room where he was working and headed out the other wall. But the intriguing thing was he could only see them from their knees upwards. And it was subsequently discovered that if you dug beneath the current 20th century floor, you went down a few feet, you found the original Roman road. So the Romans were walking on their ground level, street level, and passing through. You've got 2,000 years at least of recorded ghosts.
Yeah, that's amazing. And once you said it, it made me realize that, I believe you're right, that the English language has spread across the globe, all these tales of ghosts and sorcerers. And you can even attribute it to Shakespeare himself wrote about these kind of paranormal things.
Yes, exactly. And at Shakespeare's time, people really did believe in spirits and in demons and in ghosts. That regardless of whether because Shakespeare was after the Reformation, but regardless of whether you were Roman Catholic or whether you were Protestant, the main religious groups of the time, you all believed in afterlives and of spirits, some good, some bad, some just demonic.
So can you tell us about the green skinny fairies and their origins?
Yes. Well, this is a tale from about 20 miles from where I'm living now. And it's a little village on the outskirts of Bury St Edmunds, which is a very ancient medieval city with an abbey. And the story is that sometime during the middle of the 12th century, so we're talking, the 1150-ish era, some farm laborers were working in a field, and they suddenly saw two children approaching them, and they both had green skin, and they both spoke in a foreign language, a language that the locals couldn't understand, and they were both wearing very odd clothes, or for the time of the when they were found. And the young boy never really recovered his health and subsequently died, but the young girl eventually started eating normal, for that time, English food, human food, and gradually her skin color changed back to normal. And in later life, she, rather bizarrely, she went off and married a lawyer, which must say something or other. But when she was being questioned, where did you come from? She said that she came from a place called Martin's Land, and that it was underground, and that she and her little brother had been tending their parents' sheep, and had gone chasing one of the sheep and gone down a hole, and then emerged in the field where they were found. And she said that Martin's Land had a greenish sky and a greenish tinge to it, and never saw full daylight, and that was where she lived. And say a couple of chroniclers of the time, two separate ones, both wrote reports about it from what they'd heard and gave quite detailed and accounts of it. And everybody's been scratching their heads ever since as to say, well, where exactly did they come from? And there's a number of theories. One is that, if you like, the most mundane one is that they were actually from Europe, possibly Flemish, which is sort of Holland to Denmark area. And there were a lot of Flemish weavers in that part of the world at the time. And there was one of our many civil wars going on there. And there had been a battle near there, and that possibly they were children who'd been separated from their parents, and that possibly again they'd been living on whatever they could scrape up in terms of vegetables, and this had caused their skin to go that way. And they were wearing European clothes made of fabrics that weren't familiar in England, where wool was very much the staple clothing. And the language they were speaking was a foreign language. That's why they didn't understand English. That's the sort of, if you like, the rather mundane, bit boring one. But the other theory is that maybe they were the Fae. Maybe they were fairies. The way they described where they lived very much fits in with what we nowadays understand of the other world of fairyland, that it's, if you like, a parallel universe to ours. It's accessible through portals, and there are, and at certain times of the year you can pass from our world to the other world, and that they'd gone through a portal and accidentally turned up in our world. And I say the way they talk about the greenish light and everything sort of fits in with how people describe what living under our world is like. And then there's another version that says, actually, they may have been, pardon me, they may have been aliens. It may have been a visitation with small, childlike, green-skinned aliens. That obviously wasn't the interpretation in medieval times, because people didn't know about UFOs. But in more modern times, people said, well, maybe this is what it was. It was an encounter. And I say there are medieval accounts of mysterious things being seen in the sky. They didn't know they didn't describe them as UFOs because that wasn't in their conceptual universe, but they still saw things in the sky that didn't ought to be there, if you like. So there's the two possibilities, that they were the Fae, or that they were possibly aliens. So, but it's now nearly 1,000 years since the event, and we're never ever going to get any closer to discovering what the truth is of it. I say it's an intriguing bit of folklore and legend.
Are fairies still popular in England today?
Yeah, they are. They are still being reported, and if any of you ever see the UK edition of the Fortean Times, they regularly report on latest fairy sightings, and they've recently conducted a survey asking people to send in their accounts of encounters with the Fae in its broadest sense. And they've had hundreds of people living now who've had encounters with something unusual in recent times. So it's not something that's faded away with, the Victorian era almost. It's still with us. So that there remains a considerable interest in it, and different types of fairies, and what are they? And again, are they a subspecies, or not subspecies, parallel species of humans who are somehow managing to live separately from us? Is it some kind of multiverse going on, and they're living in a parallel existence and just occasionally crossing over? So it's fascinating. It's one of those things you think, well, that must have gone out a long time ago, but still very popular. And of course, there is now a lot of people suggesting that the Fae and aliens may be the same thing. And with our modern sensibilities, we now, if we see a short green person coming towards us, we'd think that's an alien, whereas previously people had said it was fairies. So, have we been seeing aliens for thousands of years, but we thought they were the Fae and elves and other elemental spirits, or are they the same thing? So it's an interesting one, because there's also a similarity between them, because when you read of accounts of UFO abductions, one of the things is a strange time displacement, that people think they've been gone a short time, but it's been a long time, or they think they've been gone a very long time, but it turns out it's only been a very short time. And you get the same with accounts of fairy abductions and people who accidentally step into a fairy ring of mushrooms, which is always regarded as very bad luck, and are carried off to fairyland. And they come back having danced the night away, only to discover that 10 years has passed, and the world has changed, but there's been this difference. But I say it's intriguing that both have this same time distortion thing going on there in them. So are they the same? Are they parallel? And now, if you like, mainstream science is starting to accept the concept of a multiverse of some form. There may be other versions of our world out there. Perhaps that's it. It's the inadvertent, accidental passing through from our dimension to their dimension, and vice versa.
What you're saying makes good sense, great sense to me, that it could be either, like you said, interdimensional beings that could be mistaken for aliens. What I found fascinating is that you said fairy abductions, because I'm used to UFO or alien abductions, but not fairy abductions. Can you tell me more about those?
Yeah, it's quite an intriguing thing that one of the reasons why you should never step into a fairy ring, is that they will take you away to fairyland. And there's a lot of lore, as in LORE, about fairies, saying also that you should never accept food or drink from them, because then you are beholden to them, and they will make you obey them and enchant you and hold you prisoner. And there's a Scottish folk story about Thomas the Rhymer, who was a historical person who, as the name goes, used to make predictions in rhyme. And he, according to the legend, met the Queen of Fairyland and went away with her to Fairyland for several well, he's no idea how long it was, but it turned out to be several years, and was effectively held there as her prisoner, and then escaped back from it, telling the tales of what it was like and what happened there. And I say it's a constant theme running through it, that you can't trust the Fae. One suggestion is because they used to be able to live in our world, but humans have spread and driven them out. And as a result, they resent us and dislike us and will try to thwart us or generally be unpleasant to us, to have revenge. If you go up into Scottish fairy lore, they talk about the Seelie Court and the Unseelie Court. And the Seelie Court are relatively good fairies who will put up with humans, but may play practical jokes on them. And the Unseelie Court are villains who hate humans and will just try to do them down. So as I say, there's this long tradition that you can't trust them. Never accept gifts from them.
Now, I didn't want to interrupt you, but you said if you stepped into a fairy ring, what is that?
Right. Well, it's basically a ring of mushrooms or fungus. You'd get it where a tree has been cut down at some point, but the roots are still underground and it's slowly rotting. And at certain times of the year, it throws up growths of fungus. And you get it in certain woods as well, where it grows, and it's just some strange patterning that mushrooms do. And I say, if you look on Google, you will find plenty of people sending in photographs of fairy rings they're spotted. And the tradition is that at night, the fairies dance within these fairy rings. And if any human steps in there, they're immediately caught up by the Fae. And there are some counts of people being made to dance all night and are left for near dead in the morning because they've just been dancing and dancing and dancing so long. I mean, it has to be said, some of these accounts obviously involve people who've been taking alcohol. Yeah. So, you never quite know.
Well, when you mentioned mushrooms, I thought, well, maybe we're going to go in the direction of, consuming those type of mushrooms as well.
Yeah, no, that's not one that crops up in the folklore, but I say it's a long-standing tradition. Where I grew up in north of England, there are a couple of Neolithic, so 2,000 years BC, 4,000 years ago, burial mounds, and one of them is very large and has a legend that it was actually used in later times by the Fae, the fairies. And there's an account of a man who was riding past it. We're talking medieval times, but an account of a man who was riding past it one night and could see lights coming from it, could hear the sounds of celebration. So he went over there and had a look inside and found this splendorous hall with lots of gaily dressed people all having a party, and somebody gave him a flagon with a drink in it, and he knew enough not to drink the contents. And so when nobody was looking, he tipped it on the floor, but pocketed the flagon and escaped on his horse and rode away. I was chased by the Fae, but he was able to escape because the Fae, and you get it with some other supernatural creatures, aren't able to cross running water, and he and his horse jumped over the river and got to safety. And then, curiously, the cup was given to the local lord of the manor, who gave it to the king, who in turn gave it to the king of Scotland. And there are historical accounts of a king of England writing to a king of Scotland saying, "Have you still got the magical fairy cup in your treasury?" And the king saying, "Yes, it is. Next time you're up here, come and have a look at it." So it's adding this level of almost mundane bureaucracy to an encounter with fabulous creatures.
Are there any current accounts of people saying, I was abducted by fairies?
Not being abducted, but plenty of accounts of people saying they've seen strange little people or large people. There's a bit of variation whether fairies are tiny, tiny little things with wings, or whether they are child-sized or small human-sized. But there are continuing to be accounts that people are seeing creatures of some form, humanoid creatures who are definitely not humans, and they say, that's the Fae. We're still encountering them.
What about elves? Are those popular in England, or are those more in Iceland?
They're more Iceland, but there is a bit of a mix with naming, because the Saxon Scandinavians called their magical creatures elves, and the Normans and the French who came over and invaded England, their term for them was the Fae. And so there is a view that when people talk about fairies and elves, they're actually talking about the same type of elemental, mysterious creature. And it could well be that just as we have humans with different colored skins and different sizes, that elves and the Fae also have different shapes and types. But no, we don't particularly do much about elves. As you say, it is more Scandinavian, Icelandic. We do have a thing called bogarts, which are sort of house elves or house spirits. And there's a lot of folklore about them, and was certainly still prevalent through until the early years of the 20th century. And they are again some kind of fairy-like creature that helps with houses and lives in a house and does chores, and there's quite elaborate folklore suggesting that you must never pay them directly. You must instead leave something indirectly for them to take. So you don't say, here's some food and drink for the bogart. You say, you just leave some food and drink out at night, and during the night the bogart comes and takes it away and eats it and consumes it. A bit like, I don't know whether you have that in the US, the tradition that you used to put out food and drink for Santa Claus when he visited on Christmas Eve.
Yep. Milk and cookies.
Milk and cookies, yeah. And some people also leave out carrots for the reindeer.
Do you think that science is taking this paranormal research a little more seriously in general?
I think it is. I mean, for a long time, it was very much anything that's not rigidly scientifically proven is clearly just bunk and to be ignored. But, and, you'd risk your professional career talking about it. But I think there is now so much recognition that there is things going on in the world that we don't understand and don't seem to lend themselves to a logical explanation, that scientists are now taking it seriously. I think we've sort of moved from you're either a believer or a non-believer, and it's a black and white world you're living in, to a view in the middle where you're the healthy skeptic and you realize there's something there that we don't quite understand, but we're not quite sure what it is. And again, this has been echoed in other aspects of science, the whole quantum physics system. area is involving science, which only 100 years ago would have been regarded as magic. Some of the concepts they're talking about. I think it's a wider recognition that the world isn't quite as clear as the Victorian scientists would have us believe, and that there's a huge big grey area in the middle that we don't quite understand. And cryptozoology is starting to be taken rather more seriously, and that's encouraged by the fact that every year, I think it's 2,000 new species of animals are discovered. I mean, some of them are only tiny things living on the bottom of the ocean beds and things, but we're realizing there's still a lot of creatures out there that we didn't understand, that there's creatures out there that we thought were extinct but are still around. I mean, the classic example is the coelacanth, the armored fish, which appeared in the fossil record and was last seen 50 million years ago and thought to be totally extinct. And then just before World War II, a couple of live specimens were caught off South Africa. And since then, there's been lots more of them. Well, these creatures had effectively vanished for 50 million years, but they were still there and thriving and still are to this day. What else is out there that we think was extinct or couldn't possibly exist, but is still there? In England, Scotland technically, the classic is the Loch Ness Monster, which people will say is some kind of not petrosaur, some kind of seagoing dinosaur or aquatic dinosaur, plesiosaur, that's the word. And you can say, well, how could it possibly live that long? Well, same as a coelacanth, perhaps it has. That there are places it can go and get to the sea and get to the wide ocean and thrive. And we get the same thing when we start looking at relatives, if you like, of the human race. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the Yeti, they have an Almaty in Siberia. There's various other places where they have accounts of large human-like, ape-like creatures that appear to have human traits. In England, we have a thing called the woodwoes, a wild man of the woods. And we actually have some reports of them in this part of the world where I live now, that wander around and are seen, motorists report driving down a country road and seeing some large, hairy, man-like creature shambling across the road and into the woods at the other side of the road. Are they the same? Are they ancestors of ours, or if you like, cousins of ours that still exist, but we hadn't recognized them? They've somehow managed to stay out of the spotlight, perhaps in very, very small communities, and are smart enough to realize that avoiding humans is usually the best thing to do because we can be rather dangerous, and they're still thriving. I mean, we see that with the investigation into the evolution of modern humans. It used to be sort of apes turned into ape men, turned into Neanderthals, turned into us. We now know that the human hominid family, the Homo family, we're Homo sapiens, but the other hominids out there was a point until relatively recently, 10, 15, 20,000 years ago, which is not that long in terms of the history of this planet, when there were several other species still coexisting with us. And that, in some instances, having sexual relations with us. There's the Neanderthals, and we've all got a bit of Neanderthal DNA in us. There's the recently discovered Denisovans in Russia. The Chinese are currently investigating a creature they call the Dragon Man, who again has human features but is not of the human family. And then we had that story 5, 6, 7 years ago in Indonesia on the Isle of Flores, where they found the remains of very short humans that been nicknamed hobbits, that were about 3 feet tall, Homo floresiensis. And the island is an isolated island, and other creatures there have suffered some form of dwarfism, where they've grown smaller and smaller. They've found, miniature elephants there. They've reduced in size over the generations because of limited resources. Well, these hobbits, as they're called, they were living 10,000 years ago. And according to the natives who live there, they still are seen from time to time. They live in the forest and are still there. So I say we moved from a very simplistic view of human evolution to one where, until relatively recently, there were several branches of the family living with us, and are the likes of Bigfoot, are the likes of elves even, are they all some of our cousins that are still there and hiding away?
There are so many myths and folklores throughout the planet. I would think that a lot of them have some sort of basis in truth somewhere. What do you think about that?
I think that's the intriguing thing about these things, is that the origins have been lost over time and have been handed down from person to person and changed a little. And the initial reports were inaccurate, or badly recorded or badly reported. And so the myths have grown up, and it's, stuff we haven't understood. I mean, if you just look at some of the early sketches, pictures, going back to Shakespeare's time even, of African animals like the camels and zebras and giraffes and things, they look nothing like what we know they look like. They were just passed on from one person to another, giving an account, and it's drifted along, and the exact shape has been lost. But there is something in the truth there at the beginning, but it's been misinterpreted. I mean, my favorite example of this is the dragon. Almost all cultures have some form of dragon legend. Europe, definitely. The Mesoamerica, the Aztecs with Quetzalcoatl and various of their creatures, large flying, fearsome creatures. The Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, they all have slightly different versions, but of a large creature that is known as a dragon. And all those were cultures that had no communication with each other in the until relatively recently. There was no cross fertilization of, no communication, no cross fertilization of ideas. So they all developed independently, but they must have come from somewhere. And I think this, again, it's things being discovered but not being interpreted in a modern concept, but being interpreted in the way people who've let's take the European example, until relatively recently, there was no education. If you're heading back to the Middle Ages, you've got an illiterate population. In most towns, the only educated people would be the parish priest. They had a very simplistic view of the Bible. They knew about the beast of the apocalypse, and they knew about dragons, and they knew about demons. And you are a farm laborer, and you come dragging in, and you found a Tyrannosaurus Rex skull, and you say, "What's this?" And the priest is going to say it's a dragon skull or a demon skull. There's nobody there to say, well, these were creatures that lived in the Jurassic period, and this is what they came from. That's modern science, ancient science, and they're struggling to interpret them. And whales in particular, when they've been washed up on seashores, if they've had some decomposition in them, they don't look like a fish. They look rather differently. They look like a sea serpent almost, as the flesh around the neck's gone. They're a cause of a misunderstanding. I've read an interesting account recently of reports of giants that had been seen, and it was in fact mammoth bones that had been discovered, and they'd found the bones and laid them out rather in the style of a human body, and it looked to be a giant that they'd found. And then creatures like crocodiles, saltwater crocodiles, which you get in the Far East. They are huge and scary looking creatures, massive things. They look like a dragon, huge big jaws and teeth. The Komodo dragon, there's a whole wealth of creatures out there, either extinct creatures like dinosaur bones, or living creatures that have been badly misinterpreted, or something else. And what are people going to say? Well, they're going to think, it's some kind of monster. It's a dragon, and the dragon folklore has been with us again for the better part of 2,000 years, with St. George and some of the early Christian saints being described as dealing with them. St. Michael, who's an archangel, he is a dragon slayer and is normally depicted slaying a dragon. So it's, the thing is to look at it, or try to look at these things through the eyes of the people of the time, not add our human knowledge to it. We'd see a dinosaur bone and say that's a dinosaur bone. From people 1,000 years ago, they didn't know that. It was some mysterious monster they'd found. And so the legends of dragons have continued onwards, and remains a part of global folklore, and probably will continue to. I hope it does. Lovely story.
One of your books is titled The Wold Newton Triangle. What is that, and is that an English version of the Bermuda Triangle?
It's a sort of an English version of the Bermuda Triangle. It's an area near where I grew up, and I knew lots of stories from traveling around there as a kid, of strange things going on. And it occurred to me there was so much there that it was worth writing up and putting together as a book, which I did. And I was looking for a title for it, and I noticed that the area I was talking about was basically triangular in shape. There were the northeast and I suppose southeast sides of it. Two sides of the triangle were the coast, and there was a main road going down at the other side of it, and everything happened between the main road and the coast. I got a triangle, and at the center of this triangle is a little village called Wold Newton, and there's a lot of folklore surrounding Wold Newton, and I thought, well, that's the perfect name for it, and it stuck. Right? It goes well, but it's just an intriguing place with so much, and it's a rural area where very, very few people live, and very few people have lived there for a long time. And yet it's just rich in folklore going back thousands and thousands of years. I think it deserves more coverage than it gets. It's just not well known enough.
Are there any reports of people disappearing there, like what happens in the Bermuda Triangle?
There are some reports of people that the cliffs, in fact, one of the people who'd read my book contacted me to say it was a tale she'd been told by her mother, that somebody in a boat sailed into this cave in the cliffs and was never seen again, and that there's some kind of portal there. I mean, what's intriguing on the sort of, if you like, the factual side of it, is this area is limestone, and one of the features of limestone is you get underwater watercourses. It dissolves the limestone, and you've effectively got underground rivers. So it's quite feasible that this whole area is riddled with holes and caverns and tunnels, and it's quite feasible somebody may have gone up one exploring and got into difficulties, gone too far, been cut off by the rising tide, and perished there. And it's got a reputation. There's a river that runs through it, and it's called the Gypsy Race, and gypsy as in gypsum, which is from limestone. And the river course is well known, but for most of the time it's underground. But in times of flooding and heavy rain, it bursts through the surface. And so you have accounts of people looking out of their window, and there's a field with an old trackway through it, and 10 minutes later this trackway is a torrent of water sweeping down. And say there have been historically some disastrous floods there with drownings and houses being washed away, and it's built up a reputation, again going back to medieval accounts, as being called the waters of woe, WOE, as in whenever it flows, something terrible happens. Start of a war, king getting his head chopped off. I dare say in a couple of years' time we'll be hearing that it started flowing when COVID struck. So it's one of those where it's easy to be wise after the event, but it's got, again, this long time reputation, and it's a mysterious thing. And again, you have to look at it in old-fashioned eyes. People didn't understand about geology and the dynamics of watercourses. It would just be very, very mysterious.
In that book, you write about the Redstone Stone, which is a giant monolithic stone. Is there anything that correlates that stone with the henges in Britain?
Yeah, I mean, it was placed there. It's a peculiar stone. It's worth Googling it and looking at it, because it's now right next to a parish church. And this was something the Christians did when they were moving into England in the sort of from the 7th century onwards, that if there was an established religious site, they wouldn't destroy it, but they would incorporate it into their own religion. And so they'd say, you used to go to where the big stone is to pray. Now we have a church there. And the early church had a cross stuck on the top of the stone, so it's like a spire. And even in, I think, the 19th century, there was a time when it had a cross still on the top of it. And it's this huge stone, dragged a very long way. There have been some excavations which reveal that it's over the centuries. I say it's been there for about 4,000 years. Over the centuries, it's sunk into the ground substantially, but that in terms of its height, it's far bigger than any of the stones that are at Stonehenge. And it's known where the stone came from, and that is a considerable distance away, and it would have had to have been physically dragged there. So quite clearly, there was a lot of investment by the local people of that time to erect this stone and place it there. And it is at the center of, there's earthworks that have been found that are clearly not defensive earthworks, but they have found lots of flint arrowheads there. And it's thought it may well have been an area where the young men of the time would meet every year for coming of age type rituals and sporting events. There's a number of wooden henges, just the same as Stonehenge, a circle, except that they didn't have the stone and they used large oak trees instead. A number of those being found, and a huge number of round barrows and burial mounds. Some I mentioned earlier, the big ones that people think were later haunted the home of fairies, others very small ones. A lot have been ploughed over and lost now, but it was quite clear that this was somewhere sacred people wanted to be buried, because there are more burials than the population would have been able to support. So people were clearly bringing their dead to this ritual site, as they would have had this huge stone standing there in the center of it all, in a big clearing, and all the various other ritual sites around it. And I say this is right in the center of the Wold Newton Triangle, as I christened it, and a focal point for interest and subsequently strange goings on.
I'm not aware of how much you know about hinges, but I watched a documentary on how they think that they may have moved the stones of Stonehenge. They had possibly created like a wooden track railway system and tried to roll them on this kind of wooden track on like wooden wheels, or they carved stone wheels and tried to roll it on the track. But the most fascinating thing that I thought about the whole documentary was at the very end, they noted that they moved those stones 200 miles approximately from where they quarried them from. And my thinking was, in that time period, most people never traveled more than 20 miles their entire life. Why were they moving those stones 200 miles in the first place?
I think it's because Stonehenge and subsequent, its ongoing archaeological excavations have established that there were monuments of some sort there even before the current stone rings were built. It's not a case of it was all built in one generation. Different rings were built at different times, and they've found post holes and sites of wooden structures that predated it. I think it's a bit like the Wold Newton Triangle. It was clearly a sacred area, a sacred landscape that was revered by everybody in the country almost. I mean, one of the things I remember reading about Stonehenge is they found butchery pits where cattle and pigs and the like had been brought down and clearly butchered and then cooked. And they've been able to do some DNA on the bones and found that these cattle weren't local. They'd been driven substantial distances, 100, 200, 300 miles, whatever, and then cooked and eaten. So suggesting this was some sacred site, the Woodstock of the New Stone Age, if you like, that people flock to from periodic times through history, that people travel to worship or celebrate their gods or their community. We don't know the reasons. There's no accounts of why they did it, but clearly they felt moved enough to do it. And I think this is the same at Redstone. They only dragged it 40 miles, but it was a big old stone to shift. It would have been a huge effort. And the fact there are so many burials there from people who weren't from that immediate area, that this was, a sacred area for them. And that's how they showed their devotion. I mean, you then start moving into the realm of ley lines, which I know is a bit of a Marmite topic for some people as to whether they're just a coincidence or whether there's something really important there. But both Stonehenge and Avebury, which you mentioned, we chatted about just earlier, and Rudston, they're all on ley lines. Rudston is the end of one ley line and the start of another. And throughout England, there are links between straight line tracks or ley lines between all these Neolithic sites. So, is that the connection? And, the simplest way to find your way to Stonehenge was to start at your local sacred site and just head to the next one, line of sight, and you work your way down there, the equivalent of motorway signposts, these stones and things. But I think, again, it's going back to the point we made earlier, that there's a lot going on in the world that we thought we knew, but we now realize we don't understand, and that the ancients lived far more complicated lives than we traditionally think of them and depict them. They weren't all running around in a bearskin, thumping each other over the head with a large club. They lived sophisticated lives. They had belief systems. We don't understand the details of them because there's no written records. And we're really only just starting to scratch the surface of what was going on. And it's not inconceivable that there was a sort of, there were national centers where people would go periodically for rituals.
All right. Your latest book is called Shuckland. And in your book, you write about the Black Shuck. What is that?
Oh, that's a lovely story. It is a demonic hound that supposedly haunts this part of the world. And again, there are still reports of people saying, I saw Black Shuck, still crops up. But it made its appearance in the middle of the 16th century, when in the middle of a thunderstorm, this giant dog with lightning flashing from it was seen running down the center of a church, snapping at members of the congregation, killing them, leaving them horribly wounded, and then in a flash of lightning vanished and then reappeared about 20 miles away almost instantaneously in another church in the middle of a thunderstorm, and did exactly the same thing, attacking people. And the second church, you can still see the church door, which has burn marks on the woodwork, which are said to have been made by the creature's glowing claws as it left the church. And it's just stuck as the sort of local legend. And still plenty of places are named after Black Shuck. running clubs, sports clubs. The black shuck is the symbol of the local town. And I say, intriguingly, reports continue to come in that black shuck is alive and well. And according to some legends, black shuck, this big, huge dog, some accounts say it's almost the size of a small horse and very shaggy all over. Shuck means shuggy, hairy, bit like some hairy dogs you see with the long hair on them. And I say it's just an indelible part of this part of the world's folklore. It is possible that it wasn't a demonic creature at all and was actually ball lightning hitting the church, and the accounts of some of the people's injuries are consistent with being struck by lightning. And again, you have to put into your head the mid-16th century mindset. You're sheltering in the church, and people sheltered in churches during thunderstorms because churches tended to have stone or lead roofs, whereas they lived in wooden huts with a thatched roof, which aren't very good if you get struck by lightning. So they were in the safest place they knew. It would have been dark, obviously no electric lighting other than a few candles. They would have been praying, they would have been terrified. It was a time when, again, people thought, they were being assailed by demonic forces. And suddenly there's this screaming and this large flash of light and chaos and people falling dead and people being electrocuted and being left sort of maimed. You can see how the legend would have spread up. It would also explain why it got to the next church so quickly. The storm rolled on there. But I say it's a wonderful story, but it picks up again because there's lots of legends all around the east coast of England. Interestingly, all the areas that used to be Viking territories of large dogs. And you go into Viking folklore, Woden is accompanied by a large hound, and so is it a connection from there, some kind of almost folk memory? And but I say it's a wonderful story.
I kind of start to feel that, like how swamp gas is the usual explanation of UFOs, it's like ball lightning now is the usual explanation for something else going on. Like, oh, it was probably ball lightning.
Yeah. Well, I take your point. I mean, it's noticeable with black shuck that the church warden's accounts make no mention of a demonic dog, but they do say the church tower was struck by lightning and that it smashed the clock. And the accounts of black shuck also talk about the clock exploding and springs and levers being thrown everywhere. So, yeah.
So you were speaking about the Vikings, and they were also talking. Woden also had a hound or a dog with him. Do the origins of werewolves, are they coming from the Scandinavian countries or from England, or where?
Well, I touch on this in my Wold Newton book with the tale of Old Stinker the werewolf. And he crops up in the historical record. It's first mentioned in the 11th century, but in medieval times, and he crops up later in the 18th century, and he crops up later in the mid-20th century. And he is a giant dog, said to be a werewolf, called Old Stinker because he has a putrid breath, has bright red eyes, and can stand on his hind legs and has a big, powerful tail that can knock people down. And I say he's said to be a human by day, and he will sound out, investigate markets, and learn which travelers will be traveling along a particularly lonesome road that evening. And then he transforms into a wolf and brings along a wolf pack of other wolves, and then they will attack the humans and consume them. There's a number of factors on this one, because there was a problem with real wolves, and sometime before the legend of Old Shuck, there was an actual hostel built to provide shelter for travelers, and the charter for the shelter says it's so that they won't be at risk of being eaten by wolves. So it's clearly a big problem they had with wolves. My theory about the Viking connection is everybody's heard of berserkers in Viking legend. They are the people who are high on alcohol, possibly magic mushrooms, drugs of some sort. They've psyched themselves up to go into battle. They don't wear normal armor. They will wear a wolf skin around them, typically with the wolf jaw and head on the top of their heads. And they will go into battle, and they are fearsome killing machines. And we have the 1066, which is the Battle of Hastings in England, was also the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which was the last big attempt by the Vikings to invade England. And Harald Hardrada, who was the leader of the Vikings, he was actually a berserker and went into battle with no armor, but just his big sword and a wolf skin on him. And he got killed. But along with the berserkers, with the bears, they also were an equivalent who wore wolf skins. It's a Scandinavian word that I can't pronounce, but it's Rufur, something like that. It's UILF type of spelling. Anyway, they were the same. They wore not bear skins, but wolf skins, and they would have been there. And where the legend of Old Stinker takes place, this was a part of the world where the Vikings marched through prior to the Battle of Stamford Bridge. They landed on the coast, burned a couple of towns, marched inland, and they marched past this area. And I'm just wondering whether it seems a bit too much of a coincidence that we have a legend of a half man, half wolf, as in a wolf man. And at the time of the battle, there was an army going through of men who were covered in wolf skins. So were they half men or half wolf? And once again, put yourself in the mindset of the locals. You're terrified. You don't want to be killed or worse by the Vikings. You're hiding in the woods. You're hiding under your bed or whatever. And you see these savage people, probably blood splattered from earlier fighting, marching through. They're not humans, they're monsters. They're half people, half wolves. And that's where I think the concept came through. I say it's interesting because werewolves aren't really part of English folklore. And for a long time, Old Stinker was the only one we had records of. There's been some accounts in more recent times, but they are very much 20th century creations. So I think that is where the Vikings have a lot to answer for.
That's interesting. I guess it seems that most of our modern theories or ideas, or I guess you would say ideas of werewolves and vampires, come from either Hollywood or Bram Stoker.
Yeah, that I think is the case. Bram Stoker, he did his homework and he did his research, but the aspects we all now have that They will catch fire or perish if they're caught in sunlight. That they can be fended off by garlic or silver crucifixes. That's pure Bram Stoker.
Mm-hmm.
And with werewolves, it's those couple of Lon Chaney movies in the 1930s, The Werewolf of London and The Wolfman, which sets up the thing that if you shoot a werewolf in its werewolf form with a silver bullet, it will transform on death into the human it was once before. So I think that is it's one of those things where I mean, you know, those movies and Bram Stoker, they've all now been with us for getting on for a century. So it's quite a long time for it to be sort of got into the mindset that that's what they're like. I mean, if you look, the Germans have a thing about werewolves, and they're quite believed they were a problem. But their accounts, they were just monstrous wolves, and you would attack them like you would attack any large animal. You know, you'd shoot them with guns, stab them with swords, run them through with spears, and deal with them that way. You didn't need the silver bullet bit. The silver bullet bit actually comes more from some of the tales of witchcraft, where you have tales of somebody seeing a hare running down the street and they shoot at it with their gun, and they don't have a bullet, so they take a silver button off their jacket, fold it up, use it, and fire it. And the next day, the woman in the village, who everybody thinks is a witch, has got a bullet wound and is limping. And I say that there's a number of tales of England of people encountering that. And I think it's a case of different layers of folklore have been added onto it, and to build up the better and better story.
I guess those stories will just never die. My favorite movie out of all the werewolf movies is American Werewolf in London. But in recent times, from what I can remember, there are 2 different series of movies about werewolves fighting vampires.
Yeah, the Twilight series is
there's
one
Twilight.
of them, isn't it?
Yeah, that one. I think there's another one that predates that one.
There's one. Yes. I'm trying to remember what they're called. But yes, it is that. No, I can picture the actress who plays the sort of heroine,
right,
vampire,
right.
Largely because she's wearing figure-hugging leather. But but yes, there are,
right.
And it's a sort of tradition that the different types attack, that the different sorts are immortal enemies, I suppose. And there's series of stories, aren't there? Night Watch, and is it Day Watch? I don't think they've been made into movies. They're novels, which again has vampires and werewolves living in the present day, and it's, you know, how to stop them trying to eat the human race and prey on them, and how to keep them their distance.
Speaking of novels, what are you working on right now? What is your next book?
My next book is going to be another non-fiction book, and we're still working on what the exact title will be because it's with a publisher, but it's effectively an almanac of witches and sorcerers. These are historical witches and sorcerers, and I provide historical context to the times they lived in, and then miniature biographies of all of them, and covers about 360 witches in total, but 250 in quite considerable detail, and takes us from biblical times through to the modern day. We even have the witches of TikTok on there, but it carries through, and how beliefs have changed and how reactions to them have changed. And obviously we feature the Salem witches and Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, and all the period of the great persecution of witches known as the Burning Times, from the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries, and carries it through there. And I say it's with the publishers at the moment, but I've great hopes for that one.
Well,
I think it'll be a book people will like.
Well, I wish you massive success with that book.
Thank you.
I'm running out of time, but before we go, can you leave us with one last positive message?
Oh, I think the positive message would be that we live in a world of infinite fascination. We just live in this very interesting world, and even wherever you are, there's something intriguing, something you can learn about, stories you didn't know about, stories that give you a flavor of the richness of the human experience. There's just so much fascination out there. You don't need to travel the world to find mysteries. You can find them in your own back door, back in your own backyard.
Yeah, I agree with that. Christian, thank you for being my guest.
My pleasure.
I appreciate you, and I wish you a great rest of your evening over there in England.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.